Welcome to this webinar for the 2020-2021 Essa Consolidated Federal Grant Application. My name is Carlos Garzon with Grants Administration, and we're going to be going through the application process to help you to be able to submit the application. So any pitfalls that you may happen to occur, we've kind of tested this application so it's very intuitive and it'll tell you where the errors are. But we're here to assist you as you're going through this application process to get you to submit and to help process the application in a timely manner. Just to remind you, we have posted the PowerPoint on the grants resource page. There is a link if you go to on the chat. There is a link there so that you can open up this PowerPoint presentation. There's a lot of information to cover in a short amount of time, but hopefully it'll be helpful information, and the staff at TA are always here to help. You can email us or phone us, and you have your regional negotiators for each region. So I will ask everyone to make sure that you stay muted while we're going through this, and we'll have a section where we will try to answer some of the questions, and hopefully some of the questions that you have will get answered as we go through this PowerPoint presentation. So let us begin. What we're going to be covering today on this hour and a half, we'll talk about accessing e-grants to the TEA login, the TEAL system, some of the roles that are there, some of the access that you have as those roles. We'll talk about the contact information tab, and that's where you will be pulling for your contacts for each application. The special collection, the 5003, the consolidated schedule that must be completed by all LEAs, whether you're applying on your own or applying as a member of an SSA. Then we'll talk about the designation form to be able to open the grant. Once we have the grant open, we'll talk about some of the schedules that should be completed first. Of course, the applicant information and the contacts. The important schedules you should be completing before. In the past, if you sat through some of our trainings, there was a schedule that had to be completed first before anything else. That has changed because of the way we have it formatted. We'll look at some of the important information. We'll look at the different parts of each schedule. When some parts are just required, you have to complete it in order to complete. So we'll be talking about mainly the parts where you have your discretion as to how you select the different checkboxes. And then we'll talk about the budget and supporting documents. The budget pages have changed slightly, so it is important that we go through that. And then we'll talk about the gun-free report, because that is a report that won't keep you from submitting the application, but may keep the application from being fully processed so that you can receive your Notice of Grant Award certificate via email. Of course, the first thing is accessing TEAL. If you go to our TEA homepage, at the very top in that ribbon, there is a place that says TEA login. Right up here on top. When you click on that, it takes you to this page. If you currently do not have a TEAL login, there is a button there to request a new user account. That goes to our computer access people. They will go ahead and process and give you your one user login, and then you would set up your password. They'll give you a temporary one, and then you just reset it. I do advise everyone, please make sure that when you first set up your login, that you go in and answer the security questions. You can always go in and revise your security questions once you're in there. But in case you forget your password, it will lock you out after 3 attempts if you have an invalid. But if you go and select forgot your password, it'll ask you those security questions and let you reset your password. So we are not able to reset it. You'd have to put in a TEA help desk ticket to TEAL so that they can reset it if you're unable to reset it on your own. So that is important information. It is a single user, So once you have a teal login, whether you're with one school district or another, if you switch LEAs, you can use that same password and switch the information to gain access to your new LEA. It's a more secure one, and like I said, your username will always stay the same, but your rights and which LEAs you have access to will change as you go through the system. This is different from the old T system where you had to have a different login and password for each LEA that you assisted. And then once, of course, we're in teal, you'll see on the applications e-grants, and you'll see your role. If you have multiple access to different school districts or charter schools that you are assisting, you may see them listed by each one. Make sure that you click on the right one to gain access to the correct application for that LEA. These are the standard roles that you normally see. Grantee official has all access to be able to edit, save, certify, and submit all compliance reports, applications, designation forms, special collections. Grant managers, they can do most of everything else except they cannot submit the applicant designation form, and they can't submit the original version of the applications that are in grants. Grant writer mainly is working with the grant application. They can edit and save. A grant staff can assist in completing compliance reports or special collections. And a grant viewer is just that. They can only view the information on there. They cannot change anything. ESE viewers are usually your regional assistants at your ESCs. Those are people who can go in and look up your account, look up your applications and assist you, but they can, again, it's a view only. They cannot change any information on there. So once we're actually click on our role, it opens up into the eGrants platform, and you'll see all these different tabs. First tab we're going to talk about is the context. You no longer have to go in and type in all the information for your primary and secondary contacts on that first schedule to open the application. This is where you'll be doing that. On here, it's going to list all the contacts that you have had in the past. You're able to go in, select one. You can edit and change the information if the email address or phone numbers have changed, if the title has changed. If you go in and you notice there's still people on there that no longer are at your LEA, you can remove them. And if there's someone that's new to your LEA, you can go ahead and add them. At any time, you can go in and update these contacts. However, once you've submitted the application and saved that schedule for your applicant information, it doesn't automatically update if you've changed an email address or a phone number. You'll have to go into that schedule, select that person again so that it updates the information and save it again. So we have our contacts, and now we're ready for the first schedule or first form that has to be completed before you can actually see the applications. The applications became available last week for all LEAs. This schedule, the consolidated schedule, opened up at the beginning of May so that people can start working on it. It does have to be completed so that you can see the applications. If for some reason when you go in and the status doesn't show as available, it says closed, you will need to contact possibly your first person, of course, is your TA negotiator. You can contact them so that they can go ahead and contact the person who can make this available for you so that you can complete it. A lot of questions we have since the grant went live was they couldn't see the application listed as an eligible applicant that they could apply for because this schedule had not been completed yet. It's a fairly simple schedule. This is just what we used to have on every single application for our federal grants. We've now clumped it into one form. So you have the equal access and participation. There's 2 radio buttons. First one is just that you have no barriers that exist for equitable access and participation. You select that and this part is completed. If you select the second button that you do have some barriers, then you'd have to complete the next section where you select a group, student, teacher, other, and then you put in a description of that barrier. If you're not sure what barriers you've had in the past, you can always look at last year's grant through the document library. Or if you use the help button or the instruction button on this form, you will see a list of the standard or more some of the standard barriers that have been used in the past. If none of those are the ones that you're using, you can always type in your own. And then part 2 are just our general and fiscal guidelines, the provisions and assurances, debarment and suspension. Those are required for all federal grants. The buttons there are the links to the actual documents so that you can go through and read them. If you have time, I would go ahead and open them, save them, look through them, because you are confirming that you're going to abide by these federal guidelines and assurances. And then, of course, the bottom section on there is if you are doing any lobbying activities using non-federal funds, you select no, that section is complete. You select yes, you would have to let us know for which type of federal grant are you lobbying. And then there's a link to the form that you would have to complete, and then that form you would be able to attach to your application. It wouldn't be attached to this form, it would be attached to the application so that you've submitted it to TEA, so we can have it on file. Part 2B are just all the different specific guidelines and provisions and assurances. Your program guidelines, which are important, those tell you all the allowable uses of funds, what is not allowable, and it gives you some of the information for each of the different funding sources that you would be applying for. I would always, as a personal preference, I save that onto my computer so I can always reference it, because it is a very useful information. The program division has gone through and added a lot of useful information for each of the different funding sources to help you on how you're going to be using these funds. And then there's the program-specific provisions and assurances based on statute. Now, the last part, Part C, is just a checkbox that confirms that you're going to be complying to all of these different provisions, assurances, guidelines when applying for these funds. You'll notice that it lists all the different big 3 or federal grants, your Essa, Perkins, your special ed federal and special ed state. We've had questions before that say, well, I'm assuring, but I'm not applying for special ed state funds, or I'm not going to be receiving special ed state funds, or I'm not going to be getting Perkins funds. The assurance is just for those federal grants that you do apply, whether you're applying independently on your own or applying as part of an SSA, you're giving us our assurance that you are going to follow all of these guidelines. If there's a funding source you're not applying for, those specific provisions and assurances would not apply to your grant funds. So we submitted the SE 5000, it shows submitted. If by chance you need to go back and make a change to it because you forgot a barrier on that part 1, Once you submit it, there is an amend button next to it, so you can amend it to a certain point. After a certain point, that you would not be able to amend. You'd have to contact us so that we can open it if you do need to amend it for specific reasons. But once it's been submitted, first time it's been submitted, if we go to the Grants tab and select Apply for Eligible Grants, we will now see the applications that we're eligible to apply for. By clicking on the specific grant description, the grant name, it'll open up that grant. So for our purposes, we're opening up the 2021 Essa Consolidated Federal Grant. First form that we need to complete would be the Designation and Certification form. You won't see the application yet until that form has been submitted. Again, if you see that the status shows that it's closed, contact your negotiator so that we can get it reopened. Also, if it's been submitted and you realize you submitted it in error, you marked one designation incorrectly, again, contact the negotiator and we'll make sure we make it available for you to make those corrections. So this is what the form looks like now in the new platform. It does list all of the different funding sources for Essa. And then it's got the different designations that you would be applying for. If there is a federal grant, an entitlement on the entitlement page, that line will be grayed out and the Not Apply at All button will automatically be selected. If you're not sure why it's showing as grayed out or not, it's showing as Not Apply at All, there is a link at the bottom of the schedule that takes you to that entitlement page so that you can look at it and search for your organization to see your entitlement amounts. And there is a feature on this one for copy prior year's data. If you applied for these ESSA funds last year and you completed this form, you can click on that, and other than the ones that you no longer have funds available for that says Not Apply at All, that are grayed out, the other lines will go ahead and populate to the correct radio button that you selected last year. So majority of you may be applying on your own, or you may be applying as a member of an SSA. The applying as a fiscal agent of an SSA, they're mainly those are usually ESCs that apply as fiscal agents. We do have a few LEAs that apply as a fiscal agent. If you designate as a fiscal agent, you do need to have member districts, because your FAR codes on your NOGA will be incorrect. And your budget office will be setting them up with different codes. So that is important, and we do check on those. If you marked a fiscal agent and you weren't a fiscal agent last year, we double check to make sure it was correct. If not, we will send it back to you to make those corrections. There is an enhancement that we've added in terms of a warning, not an error, that occurs if you select multiple designations. If you select Apply on Own, Not Apply, and Apply as a member of an SSA for different funding sources, you'll get an error, not an error message, but a warning letting you know that you selected multiple designations, and just to quickly verify to make sure those are correct before submitting. In the past, we had people that accidentally submitted, marked Apply on Own, and they wanted to be applying as a member of an SSA, or they put Apply on Own on everything and one as a fiscal agent, and it should have been Apply on Own. We didn't discover that until the application was submitted, and we're negotiating and reviewing it. And then we have to go back and open it. We have to open up the application back to you so that you can save the information so that your NOGA certificate populates correctly. So that's why we did add that little warning message, just to remind you to double check your designations before submitting to us. And of course, on Title III, Part A, ELA, the system knows, based on your entitlement, if it's less than 10,000. If it's less than 10,000, you cannot apply on your own for these funds. You either have to apply as a member of an SSA or not apply. Again, if you apply as a fiscal agent and you're only receiving, let's say, $6,000 for Title IIIA, your members of the SSA, when they select you as the fiscal agent, must total completely yours and their allocations over 10,000, or the application won't let you complete the budget summary. So it is important that you select the correct. Applying as a fiscal agent will let you under 10,000, but you'll have to make sure you have member districts to go over that $10,000 threshold to complete the application. And of course, if you apply as a member of an SSA, there is a section for you to go in and select for each of those your designated fiscal agent. Most of the ESCs have completed that, so you should be able to go in and select your fiscal agent. If your fiscal agent does not appear in that drop list, give your contact at the ESC a call to make sure that they designate it correctly. And maybe they're not applying as a fiscal agent. You can look at last year to see who you designated as a fiscal agent for last year's funds and select them. The fiscal agent doesn't automatically pre-populate when you complete the prior year data. Just the little radio buttons of apply on own, fiscal agent, not apply, or member. So there were no errors. We completed it, we submitted it, and now the application is now available for us to start working on the actual application. So we just have to click on the application name to open the table of contents for the application. And I'm not going to show you the table of contents. We all know what it looks like. It just lists all the different schedules. Now we're going to go ahead and go through all the different schedules that you'll have to complete in order to submit the application. The first one is, of course, the GS 2100. Your applicant information. When you look at the table of contents, this will be the only schedule that is enabled. All the others will be grayed out. This has to be completed first so that all the other schedules that are necessary based on the funds you've designated to be applying on own will populate. So we do have to select 2 contacts. And your primary, again, here you just select contact, you select from the drop list. If the person is not there, there is a button to add new contacts. Just to let you know, when you click on that, it will take you out of this schedule. So if you haven't saved anything, it won't save it. But it'll take you back to that contacts tab so that you can enter in that additional contact. Then you just have to go back, apply for eligible grants, open the application, and open up the GS21 again, select that. We do ask for 2 different contacts because during negotiations, these are the emails that will get a notification from eGrants that we've sent your application back for negotiations. So make sure that we do have good contact phone numbers and good emails that during the summer, person will be able to see those emails and access the application to make the changes so we can, and have the application resubmitted to us so we can process the application. So we submitted the 2100. Now all the other forms and schedules are available. And in the past, we always said, do your SC 5000, the campus selection first, because it populated other fields and other schedules. That's not true anymore. And we'll talk about the SC 5000 last. You can do that one at any time, but we do ask you, there's at least 2 schedules we ask you to complete first, because these do drive some of the data that populates in some of the other program schedules. The first one, of course, is the PS 3109. And the PS 3109 is your REAP funding or transferability. And just to let you know, you do have to complete that. These do not apply to complete the schedule. Part A is the Rural Education Achievement Program REAP. And if you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, there is a link to those campuses that have that, what we call that are on this REAP list. It's the dual eligibility. So if you're on that list, you can use REAP. If not, all LEAs can use funding transferability. And you can transfer or REAP the funds into any of the funding sources that are listed in that section. Just to give you the difference between REAP and transferability. REAP is a more flexible use. The LEA that is on that list that wants to use REAP is just letting us know they would like to have that flexibility to use Title II or Title IV funds or one of the other funding sources for those allowable activities. The majority of them, they usually will put into Title I, Part A. So REAP gives you that flexibility to allow you to use Title II or Title IV for Title I, Part A activities. Transferability is notifying TEA that your LEA is going to transfer the funds from Title II or Title IV to be used for that, again, Title I, Part A allowable activities. So if you transfer 100%, all of those funds need to be an allowable cost under Title I, Part A. We don't ask for that documentation, but auditors will ask how you're coding it to make sure that it's an allowable use if you're transferring. If you're reaping, you have the flexibility to be able to use it for those funding sources, but it's not required because you haven't notified us as a transfer. It's just a flexibility to be able to use it as appropriate for Title I, Part A. You'll see when we get into the budgets, we're not physically moving the monies into the funding source that you're either reaping or transferring. They stay under that funding source. But we will have to complete this. If you're not going to be using REAP or transferability, you just check does not apply for Part A and B and save it, and it will complete. The transferability part is important because if you transfer into one of the other funding sources and you have private nonprofit participation, it will populate on that next schedule, which is the one that we ask you to complete second or third, actually, after the applicant information page, the PS 3099. Most of this information calculates automatically. On Part A, you would just notate whether or not you have any PMPs in your area, or you have any Title I eligible students that are at a private nonprofit outside of your boundaries, but are ones that you identified that live in your boundary areas, but they're going to a PMP outside your boundaries. If you mark no for both, the rest of the schedule will gray out because you've completed. If you mark that you do have PMPs, it'll ask you to select for which funding sources do you have private nonprofit participation. You'll check yes or no for each funding source. If you mark yes for Title 1A and no for all the others, only Title 1A will be enabled for you to complete the data. So in this case, we marked yes for Title 2 Part A. And they're basically all the same. You would complete lines 1 and 2, number of student enrollment, the number of private nonprofit school students. And then if you have any direct administration reservations, you would enter in that amount. And the calculated private nonprofit fair share would calculate as how much is going to your PMPs. That's all. That's what you do here. You'd save it and complete the schedule. It's populating your allocations based on those entitlements. Part 1, Title 1 Part A, if you do have PMPs, you will see on our next schedule, the 3101, you will have someplace where you have to put in those reservations. So PS 3101 is your Title 1 Part A district reservations. Part 1A just shows your funding amount. Here's where 3109 is important. If you have transfers in or out from Title 2 or Title 4 Part A, the amount that is transferred in to Title 1 Part A will populate on here, and then the total amount is the amount that you're using for Title 1 Part A. That's why I said it's important we fill out if you had any transfers in that 3109. And on the next section, you'll see lines 2 and 3. If you had Title 1 Part A participation, those two fields would not be grayed out, and you'd have to put in a dollar amount. It would tell you you're required because you have participation and you have an amount that's, and you may have put in a district reservation for administration, and it'll check to make sure those numbers match what was on the 3099. If you do not have any other reservations, you do have to mark the NA checkbox for each of those line items in order to complete this. The ones that you do have to remember that it will require you that if you are receiving $500,000 or more for Title 1A, which includes any transfers in to Title 1 Part A, you do have to reserve a minimum of 1% for line 1 for parent and family engagement activities. And it'll let you know that if the percentage doesn't validate to that 1%, it'll tell you need to add in the correct amount. Also, based on Essa statute, you are required to reserve funds for services to homeless students. We do ask that it is a meaningful reservation. We are looking at it for at least usually $100 or more, but no less than that. And all the other reservations should be a meaningful reservation. These aren't ones where you would put in a placeholder. It's not necessary to put in $1 for neglected or delinquent facilities. If you have no neglected or delinquent facilities and you just want to have them there just in case, again, because this application, once you submit, you can always amend. If your needs change and your reservations change, you can always come back in and amend and correct these reservations. And line 5 is for administrative costs, which includes personnel, but it does not necessarily include indirect costs. You don't have to include, this is direct district reservations. Indirect costs, whether you budget it in the budget amounts, in the budget summary or not, as long as you have an approved rate, you can still claim indirect costs. So it's not necessary for you to include it on here. Other, line 11, we usually will see items like for your technical assistance that you pay to your ESCs. And it should be a reasonable amount of funds reserved for them. Again, Title I, Part A should be funds that are going for services to students. So we do look at this and make sure that we're not reserving too much at the district level and funds are not funneling down to the students. Yeah. And now we're just going straight down the different program application funds and schedules, because at this point, once we've completed those first 3 schedules, you can enter and complete them as necessary. If you do have neglected or delinquent facilities, this will be a required schedule. It shows up on everyone in case when you did your special collection report, there was after that was submitted, you had a neglected or delinquent facility that opened up. You can always add new facilities. So if you completed that special collections report, the facilities will automatically pre-populate on this in Part 1B. And so you would just indicate on here if it's a closed facility or if it's still open. If it's closed, you mark yes. If it's not, it's just a no. If it's closed. If it was closed, you marked closed. You just have to let us know if any services were provided for this current year. We're talking about the 2021 year. Yes or no. The type of facility, when it's pre-populated, will automatically designate either neglected or delinquent. And then you let us know, are you using Title I, Part A funds for this facility to help support it? Are you using Title I-D funds to help support it? And then, of course, your date of agreement for your delinquent facilities, your agreement letter. We do ask that it is no more than 2 years old. We ask you to update them. Sometimes you don't need to. If it's more than 2 years old, your negotiator may ask you just to verify that it is still meets all the intent of your partner at the facility of what the services you will be providing and the services they will be providing as part of the partnership. And then you just check the written agreement assurance that you are following all of that. Part 2 are just check boxes. What are your planned expenditures for these programs? You can check one or more, but you have to have at least one selected in order to complete this schedule. And the next one, of course, is your Title I, Part C migrant. If you have migrant funding, you'll see this schedule to complete it. Part 1 is just your consultation date with your parent advisory committee. It should be prior to the first day of school. So I know in these times right now, it is difficult to organize some of these committee meetings, especially if we're doing it through media instead of face-to-face. But if the date of consultation is planned for sometime during the summer, you can't put a summer date. You can put a July date even though you're submitting it June 30th, as long as it's prior to the first day that you're going to be starting classes with these students. And the system will let you put it in up until the date of September 3rd, which is when the due date for these applications are. Part 2 are just check boxes, and they're all the required PFS action plans, all your required activities. Part 2 and 3, they're just check boxes and all have to be selected in order to complete the schedule. Part 4 is where you have more of a selection of the different types of services that you'll be supplemental activities for the different grade levels. You can select any that apply or all that apply for each of the different grade levels. If you select NA for any of these lines 1 through 4, on line 5 you will have to put in an explanation. You'll notice there is a new line item that wasn't there last year, out of school youth. Our program staff are collecting this information. If you have any out of school youth and you're doing for migrant programs, what type of supplemental activities are you providing for them? If you have no out of school youth, you can mark NA and put no out of school youth. We do have a few of our rural communities and some of our charter schools that maybe have only grades 6 through 12. They do not have EE or kindergarten or grades 1 through 5. And if it's notated that way and you put in the explanation, as long as you have a reasonable explanation, you can save the schedule, it completes, then we go on to the next schedule. Next schedule we're looking at is Title II, Part A. And you notice this one has changed a little bit on Part A, available funding. It now shows the amount that was transferred in from Title IV into Title II. And if you had any Title II funds transferred out, it'll show the amount that was transferred out. So now line 4 shows the total amount that is allocated for Title II, Part A use of funds. And Part B, we've reduced this down to 3 checkboxes. If you have funds available on line 4, you do have to select at least one of those, or you can select other and type in with the other allowable activity. Recruiting, supporting, and retaining effective teachers and principals. Professional development and growth specific activities. That one, if you do have PNPs participating from Title II, Part A, that one is the one that is the appropriate use of funds for your PNPs. So that does need to be checked at least for PNPs. And then line 3 is evidence-based specific activities. And for those evidence-based is what we used to see as class size reduction. If you're using these funds for class size reduction to hire professional staff, just to let you know, and it's something that you must have it and document it, that it must be evidence-based. It must be to improve student outcomes. And it's not, has anything to do with your grades K through 4 for the 22-to-1 ratio, which is the state requirement, the state mandate. Okay. And now we're on PS 3106, Title III, Part A, ELA. Part A, the supplemental activities. These are just at least one item must be selected. On Part 1B, your supplemental activities for parent, family, and community engagement. For Title III, Part A, ELA, all of these activities are required that you use these funds for supplemental activities if you receive Title III, Part A. It will not let you complete the application if you only select 1 or 2. You have to select all of them. And then Part C, you must select at least one of those supplemental activities. If you select and enter in other only, you still have to select at least one of the other ones that are listed. And if there's additional activities that aren't listed on here, you can go ahead and add the others and manually type in, just to make sure that it is addressing those students that are eligible to receive ELA funds. Oops. And now we have the second part of this is Title III, Part A, Immigrant. This is a new schedule, 3114. We started using it last year. We separated the two into two separate ones because not everybody gets Immigrant. Those allocations change from year to year based on the formula that FFCR, or Federal Fiscal Compliance and Reporting Division, uses to determine who's eligible for these funds. So on this one, because it's a short list of LEAs that are eligible to receive these funds, there's a little bit more flexibility. For the supplemental activities, you can select any of those, including the one that says other instructional services. For your parent and family and community outreach, again, you can select one or all, or NA if you're not using these funds for these outreach supplemental activities. NA is an acceptable answer. And for Part C, your support for personnel, you have teachers and paraprofessionals. You can select recruitment, training, or NA for either or both. It's up to you on how you select this. So this schedule, if you have it and you have to complete it, it's a fairly easy schedule. There's not much in here. Again, if your needs change on any of these program schedules, you can come back in and amend it after it's been awarded. And then we have the PS 3107, Title IV, Part A. And you'll notice this one has the same thing that Title II, Part A, Title 3104 has. Your current year's allocations, now this one has any transfers in from Title IIA and any transfers out from Title IVA. So your total allocation and transfer amount, number 4, is the important number that you need to look at because that determines the next section on how you'd be filling this out. And the next section is Part B, Planned Uses of Funds. And we're following according to current statute because we don't have a waiver for the 2021, so we're still using what's required in statute. That if you're receiving less than $30,000, you can select at least one service area. You're not required to divide it up between all the different service areas of well-rounded, safe and healthy students or effective use of technology. If you're receiving more than $30,000, which includes any transfers in, then you do have to select all 3 of the service areas based on the requirements of and the rules indicated. And for direct administrative costs, which is line 1, you are limited to 2% of the total amount. And what always confuses people year after year, your total amount of your allocations are lines 1, 2, 3, and 4. Line 5, your technology infrastructure, is actually part of line 4. And you're limited to 15% of what you budgeted in line 4. It's not 15% of the total amount, just the amount that's indicated for effective use of technology. So you'll get error messages if line 5 is larger than line 4 or line 5 is more than 15% of line 4. So if you are budgeting your 15% for infrastructure, make sure that percent is also included on line 4 so that it shows complete 100% budgeted. And then the next section, Part 2, the program required assurances, it'll know based on what the amount that's allocated, including transfers in. If it's more than 30,000, you'll be required to check that first box, line 1. If it's less than 30,000, line 2. Part B, you would just everyone is required to check that box And Part C, the supplement not supplant requirements. Title IV Part A does have that supplement not supplant rule, so both of those check boxes for assurances that you're following those rules and regulations must be checked. Parts D, E, and F are specific to the activities that you're going to be using for those different programs based on what you budgeted. If you only budgeted for one service area, you'll only have to check the box for that service area. If you've selected for 2 or all 3 service areas, then all 3 will be required to be checked, that you're just providing that assurance that you're going to be using it for the effective use and for the allowable use of those funds. For more information of how the type of allowable uses of funds you can use, the activities, I always go back to refer to the program guidelines for Title IV Part A. It does have information there along with our grants resource page, our website. There is a section for Title IV Part A with additional resources to assist you. And then we have this one schedule, which is not a program schedule, but it's one that sometimes we overlook. It's the EdFlex Title 1A school-wide eligibility form. This form only has to be filled out if you have a campus that cannot be school-wide on their own. And we'll talk about school-wide eligibility when we get to the SC 5000. But that is, according to the rules, that they have a low income percentage of at least 40% or higher to be school-wide on their own. Now, in order to apply for this, if they're not school-wide on their own, they must be a Title I eligible campus. And there's 3 ways to be a Title I eligible campus. One is they have at least 35% low income, or two, their low income percentage for that campus is equal to or greater than the district's low income percentage. And the last one is the LEA is a single attendance area, which means that they have 1,000 or less students enrolled, or they have served campuses with no grade span duplication. There isn't 2 campuses with the same grade level. That's the definition for a single attendance. Single attendance area, all campuses are Title I eligible. You only have to complete this for a campus you want to be school-wide eligible the first year you're asking for this waiver. Every year that you're using the school-wide eligibility EdFlex waiver, you do not have to complete this schedule year after year, just that first year. The negotiators will verify when you submit that you've used it in the past. If you haven't, we'll let you know that this is the first year you're using this. You will have to complete this to designate which campus, so that our program area, when they look at this, they can verify that you have the documentation that's required. And on our EdFlex waiver webpage, which is listed on the bottom, there's a link to it. You will find those forms to complete that you have to maintain locally. And we only have a few LEAs that complete this from year to year. If the campus is above 40%, there is no need to even fill in this information and complete it and save it. It's only if you're applying for school-wide eligibility on a campus that cannot be school-wide on their own, the first time, for the first year. It may be a new campus. It may be a campus that was school-wide on their own, and now they've exhausted all the ways to be school-wide on their own. They can't use any of the other bases of eligibility. And now they have to complete it. So I'll stop right now real quick to see if we have any burning questions that we might be able to answer before we continue. we still have about a half an hour, and we still have to get through the budget schedules. So are there any questions that we might be able to answer at this point?
Carlos, there are lots of burning questions this morning. We've been trying to answer some of them as we're going along, but we still have quite a bit to get through. Let me see if I can start. This one is about e-grants roles. Can multiple people that work with different parts of the application request a view-only account?
Yes, they can. However, it's recommended that you only have one role for each district. Only reason is in previous years with some of the different browsers, if you have multiple roles, the system doesn't know what your rights are, and it may hinder what you're able to do if you're in the wrong role. So we always, we see ones that have, they've said we want to be grantee official, grantee manager, and grantee viewer, we'll ask them to pick the one that's most significant based on what rights they need to be able to do in the system. But in terms of having different roles for different LEAs that you're providing support, you could be a grantee viewer for one district and a grantee manager for another district. The system will let you do that. As long as you click on the right role, you'll be able to get the right access for that LEA. So it does allow you to add multiple roles, but for different LEAs.
Okay, the next question is regarding SC 5003. Do you have to have a barrier?
For Essa, it's not required. I know on some of the trainings with special ed, they do recommend, because there are some specific barriers for IDEA B students that all LEAs must address. But to complete the schedule, it doesn't require you to put in a barrier. As I said at the beginning, if after you've submitted it, one of your other programs say, oh, we need to add these because we are using these strategies because we have identified this barrier, you can go and amend the 5003.
Okay, we have received several questions related to REAP and transferability. Dee Dee or someone from the program panel, do you mind just quickly explaining the difference between REAP and transferability and who's eligible?
Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay. The difference between REAP and funding transferability is for REAP, you have to be what you call SRSA eligible or eligible to receive Small Rural Schools Achievement Program. That list is posted on the Grant Opportunities webpage, and that's where you can find out whether or not you're eligible. But if you would have known whether or not you are SRSA eligible as we reached out to districts to let them know. And that is a grant that is through the U.S. Department of Ed. Any district that is REAP eligible is able to do REAP. If you're not REAP eligible, you will not be eligible to do REAP, and the negotiator will look at that on the PS 3109. Any district is eligible to do funding transferability. And if you elect, the difference between REAP and funding transferability are the programs that you are able to transfer money into. You can only REAP or do funding transferability out of Title II Part A and Title IV Part A into a designated program. You can REAP 100%, you can REAP or do funding transferability of up to 100% of your funds. If you do that, then you will not be required to do the program schedule. Now, if you do REAP, you still maintain your budget in the program that you REAP money out of. The same thing goes for funding transferability. The intent of of REAP is mainly for small schools, but funding transferability is open to any district. If you do funding transferability, you are actually transferring the money into another program, and you will see it on Title II Part A and Title IV Part A at the top of the schedule. It'll show you what that new allocation looks like once you've done funding transfer. Also see it on Title I. So that will change the allocation amount if you are transferring money into Title I, which is what we normally see with funding transferability. And if you do funding transferability, the amount that you transfer into that program will now take on the requirements of the program that you transfer that money into, which is different from REAP. So that is something to consider if you're doing funding transferability. I think I've answered all those questions. There's also in the program guidelines, there is a side-by-side of REAP and funding transferability to kind of show you what the differences between the two programs are. But again, you have to be eligible for REAP in order to utilize that flexibility. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dee Dee. We have also received a few questions regarding Pmp Equitable Services, what that is and how to find out if you have Title I students in your area or outside of your boundaries attending PMPs. Lenitra, can you address that, or someone from our program team?
Good morning, everyone. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. For private nonprofit equitable services, that is funding that is set aside specifically for eligible private schools to be able to participate. And under ESSA, those eligible private schools would need to ensure that they have documented proof of nonprofit status that they would provide to the LEA. And generally that would be a 501c3 form or some other proof from the IRS or an umbrella agency or organization in which they are labeled as private nonprofit. The private school does not receive funding, they receive services. And for Title I Part A, services must be eligible for those students that would have lived in or would have attended a Title I Part A public attendance area and that have an educational need. And so you do have to reach out as an LEA to private schools outside of your district. And the way to do that, what most districts do is they provide newspaper ads, they post the information in various places if they're a small rural location so that they can try and get the attention of those smaller private schools that may not know that there are equitable services available. For all the rest of the titles other than Title I Part A, the private school must reside within the district boundaries in order to receive services. For example, when it comes to Title II Part A, Title III Part A, or Title IV Part A, the private school must be within the district boundaries. For Title I, the private school can be within the boundaries or outside. It depends on the residency of the Title I student that would have attended. I'm not sure if I answered all the questions.
If not, jump back in there and we will see if we can get back to your questions. But thank you so much, Lenitra.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's go ahead and continue on. Again, so if your questions aren't answered, you can always send those questions to your negotiator or to TEA, and we can try to answer those questions, especially if they're specific to your grant. We can look at your grant to make sure that we have everything correct and you've documented what you need. But let's go ahead and continue on to now the budget pages. This is where you're actually putting in your funds. It looks a little bit different from last year, and all the supporting budget pages will have to be completed and saved in order to complete the application. Even if you have no monies budgeted under a specific class object code, you will be required to open up that schedule and just save it. So part A, part 1, is just your available funding. This is the amounts that are pre-populating based on how you submitted your ADC. If you're submitting to apply on your own, you'll show your planning amounts. If you're the fiscal agent, it'll show the amounts of your planning amount plus all your SSA members that have designated you as their fiscal agent. To view that list, there's a little link to say view list of SSA members at the top. You click that and it'll show all the LEAs that said they want you to be their fiscal agent, and it'll show their planning amounts so you can verify who has submitted, who hasn't. And you can reach out to those that haven't completed it yet so that you can complete the application on their behalf. Part 2 is where you're going to be actually budgeting the amounts that you need to complete. And this year, it's a little bit different from last year. This schedule, the BS 6001, must be completed with no errors and saved before the other supporting budgets will open. Just the very first time. Once it's been saved and complete, you can open up the other budgets, correct them. If you need to go back and make changes to the budget summary, you can, but it won't automate if you get another error message, it won't close the other supporting budget pages once this has been saved at least once and completed. So you do have to go ahead and put in on part 2 your details by class object code: 6100, payroll, contracted services, supplies and materials, other operating costs, debt services, capital outlay. And then at the very bottom on line 9 is where you would put in your indirect cost. If you didn't apply for funds, or you applied as a member of an SSA for a specific fund, those areas may be grayed out. It won't let you put in any dollar amounts. Just to let you know, you'll see that if you transferred funds from Title II or Title IV into Title I, the money still shows up under the original funding source. You would just have to budget under those budget sources. If you're reaping or transferring those funds into, because normally it's into Title 1A, it is up to the local LEA's policy on how they're going to be budgeting those funds and paying those funds out for reimbursement. We don't see it on here. You're going to still report it under Title 2A, but however you're paying out your personnel, that's something that you would document and follow your local district policies to determine how you pay under what funding source. And this would be, of course, if you're using REAP or transferability. And as you look at the table, as you look at everything on here, when we talk about if you complete budgets for 6100, you'll have to complete a supporting budget schedule, 62, 64, 65, 66. 6300 is not included. There is no supporting budget schedule because 6300 does not require specific approval. If you wonder for the different supporting budgets and class object codes, what items require specific approval, on our grants resource page, there is a budget cost handbook that goes through on what requires specific approval, what does not require specific approval. You can always refer to that to determine how you need to budget those items in those supporting budget cost schedules. And something new this year that wasn't there last year, in previous years, we had 3 columns for Title III Part A ELA. We had a program cost, an admin cost, and then a total cost. So you had to go in and budget money under program costs, and if you had any direct admin costs, you had to budget it, and it would have to equal the total amount of the allocations. Now, this new year, on the top section, you would fill in the total amount on one single line, and if you are receiving Title III Part A, Part 2B will appear, and you'll have to go ahead and just identify if you have any, from the amount that you budgeted on top, if you have any direct admin costs under the different class object codes, it will check the validations because Title III Part A is limited to no more than 2% in direct admin costs. Does not include indirect. But it's looking at your total cost and to make sure that you're not exceeding the 2% in direct admin. If you have no direct admin, you can leave this blank, save the schedule, and if there's no errors, it'll say completed, and you can move on to the next schedule. And of course, usually the next schedule we do is payroll, 6101. Same thing applies if you have no monies budgeted under payroll for a specific for a specific funding source. Those columns will all be grayed out. You won't be able to go in and select the check boxes or select anything on here. The first line just shows you the amount that you budgeted on the 6001. So you can see how much you budgeted. So if there's a budgeted amount, we do need to complete Part 2. Part 2, A is your administrative and support staff. And those are just the number of positions that you're paying out of those funding title sources. If you are split funding a person, you would include them under the different funding sources. How you do time and effort and how you notate that would be up to how you have it defined for the cost objective. Because they're the ones who do the time and effort certification and your 1-year certifications for that, for split funded people that aren't 100% funded out of one funding source. But that's locally defined and it's based on your job descriptions and how you're maintaining those time and efforts. We don't see it on the application. We're more concerned about the number of positions that you want to pay out of these funds for each funding source. Part B and C are just check boxes. So we don't need to know how many you're going to be paying at the LEA or district level or at the campus level. You just have to check a box and let us know that you're paying for those at those levels. Professional staff and paraprofessional staff, people have asked, what's the definition? That's your definition as how you classify persons as professional or paraprofessional staff. That's locally defined. And then the same thing applies to whether they're an LEA district level or campus level position. It would be as how you define that position. We don't make those distinctions because every LEA is different on how they code their personnel and their job descriptions are different. Part 3, and we've had a lot of questions about that. Line 1, school-wide personnel, that checkbox for any funding source. That school-wide personnel, in the past, you had one for every funding source. Normally, it applies for Title I, Part A funds for those campuses that you've identified on the SC 5000 as being school-wide. This checkbox covers all personnel at that school-wide campus. That includes paraprofessionals, professionals, any staff member that's at that campus. If they're being paid out of Title I Part A, you can check this box, and you're not required to check them on Part 2C under campus staff. It covers them. However, because there's only one checkbox, it covers any funding source. So you have to make sure that if you're using this, if you're not using REAP or transferability, this would only apply for Title I Part A funds. If you're using REAP or transferability for Title II or Title IV, and your 100% is going into Title I Part A, then that checkbox would apply for those funds that are budgeted for payroll. Also, if you want to use it for all funding sources that you budgeted for, if on the SC 5000 you are combining your funds, you're consolidating not just Title I, but you're consolidating your federal funds at the campus level, the school-wide checkbox would also apply. So it's a little tricky, and there's no validation because it's all funding sources. So you can check that if those rules apply. If you're not sure, again, contact your negotiator. They can look at your application, see how you have funds budgeted, see how you have your campuses designated, and advise you the most appropriate places you might have to put in checkboxes so we don't have to send it back for negotiations. Line 2, stipends and extra duty pay. It can be checked for any funding source, substitutes, and then incentive pay. And we get questions, what's the difference between stipends and incentive pay? That's locally defined. In the past, where we had specific line items that you had to add in descriptions, we had both. We had some districts that use the word stipend to mean a certain thing, and some districts use incentive pay. The best examples I can give you is there are some districts that provide a stipend for bilingual certification. At the end of the year, a teacher will get a stipend if they get their certification in bilingual ed. There are other instances, like in Title II Part A, for recruitment and retention of teachers in hard-to-place core curriculum. Some districts have an incentive pay that's paid to someone if they sign to be a teacher for 2 years at their district for those math or science courses that they have difficulty hiring. Those are a couple of examples that I have seen, but again, that's locally defined on how you use them for your documentation. And then the final thing on here is just Part 4, the certification and confirmation that you are using these according to all federal supplement and supplant provisions. And you have all the documentation to determine that the positions that are being funded under these grants meet the purpose, goal, and objectives of that federal funding source. All that documentation, again, is maintained locally, unless TEA requests copies of that or auditors request it, but you do have to maintain all of that locally. Just a point, make sure that if you are paying out of these funding sources, that for payroll positions or anything that's being paid, always make sure that it's something that has been addressed on your comprehensive needs assessment for your LEA. Oops. 6201, we didn't have this before, now we do. And there's really only 2 lines on here where you would budget in. If you have monies budgeted, you'll see that there's an amount under remaining that do not require specific approval. As you put in dollar amounts for rental or lease or professional and consulting services, you'd put in the dollar amounts. Any amount that's remaining would be the items that do not require specific approval. Again, look at your budget cost handbook to determine what those are, and always refer to your local policies. You do have to make sure that you are following your district's policies or how you're doing professional and consulting services, your bid process, and so forth. And if you have nothing budgeted under 6,200 for any funding source, and all the remaining amounts show zero, all you have to do is save the schedule to complete it. We're skipping 6,300 because there is no schedule. They all do not require specific approval. 6,400 is your other operating costs. The items we see here primarily are usually out-of-state travel, travel for students or conferences, and educational field trips are some of the ones that require specific approval. You would just put in the dollar amounts. The majority of these do not require you to attach any documentation. You do have to maintain it locally. Just to let you know, there are some that says that requires pre-authorization in writing. On our other documents that requires prior approval on that website, you will find some of these documents that you'll have to complete and submit to a specific programmed area. It doesn't come with the application. You don't have to attach it to the application, but you do need prior approval from usually either TEA or USDA for specific line items before that activity can occur. So even though it may be budgeted on the application and we processed it and you've gotten the NOGA, that does not mean it has been approved. If it requires pre-authorization, you have to have that documentation as well, that it has been approved to be able to have it charged back to this federal grant. And again, there's a link at the bottom for where those approval documents are. And at the bottom of each form, it tells you where you need to email or send that document to. And 6501 is debt services. This one is one that's used very rarely. It's when you have items, a lease purchase that you can't pay in one full year. If it's a purchase that could be done in a single year, it's best to budget it as a direct purchase. But if it's an item that you cannot pay, completely pay it in 1 year, and you've done this lease purchase, it's usually at least a 2 to 3 year period. You would tell us in which funding source you budgeted, and if it's for lease principal, if it's for interest, or it's interest on debt. And then for each of those funding sources that you budgeted for debt services, you would add a line to identify what type of property it is, the funding source, your contract date, which is usually at least this current year and maybe the previous year and maybe including next year because it's a 2-year purchase, the value, the property value, and of course the campus number if there is a campus number. And like I said before, all of this has to be addressed in your comprehensive needs assessment to show that it is a need and that it is an allowable cost to spend it from these funds. Capital outlay, we kind of switched a little bit. What used to be at the bottom is now on top. We noticed that in previous years, people would budget $50,000 for capital outlay. They would list all of these equipment items, and then under library, books, and media, they would list $50,000. So we weren't sure if they were actually budgeting for media books or that $50,000 were for the equipment on the bottom. So now we kind of switched it. If you have nothing budgeted for library books or media or for additions and improvements of your capital assets, line 3, the remaining amount that populates there from your cost that you budgeted on the 6,001 should be for the items on line 2. So if you have anything a dollar amount listed there for line 3, you would have to include a generic description of the equipment, the funding source, the number of units, and a description on how it's going to be accomplished. We are no longer asking for the campus numbers. We don't ask for dollar amounts, but we do need to know the number of units and a description. And it should be a generic description. For some reason you have 0 and you've entered in something on part 2, you'll get an error message that you don't have enough money budgeted to include equipment. That was something that we had to keep sending back for negotiations because it wasn't adding up correctly, and it was allowing you to put in everything under library books, and then you'd had 20 entries for equipment. So there was not enough money budgeted for both. And of course, it should be aligned to your federal or local policies as to how you capitalize. Federal EDGAR rule says any single unit of 5,000 or more must be capitalized. If your LEA has a more restrictive capitalization threshold, then you use the one that's more restrictive. Some districts have a $500 capitalization threshold, so anything that falls above that threshold, you need to show it as 6,600. Of course, it must be an allowable cost. It should be identified at your local level for the campuses and eligible students. Since we're not asking for that, if you're budgeting for equipment for Title 1C Migrant, it should be being used for those identified eligible students. And you should have that documentation as how you're identifying that. It should be addressing your CNA and or your DIP. And as a caveat, if it's an item that's an unusual cost, it may require approval. Sometimes we see things that are not normally budgeted. We won't go back and have you remove it. We will just remind you that you may need to complete on that requiring specific approval, a form for unusual cost items. It's not part of the application. And just because it's been budgeted and it's been processed through, if you don't get approval for that item, you would not be able to charge it against this grant. And of course, it is your responsibility to make sure you submit the documents to request this in a timely manner before you make those purchases, so you won't have to back it out of your expenditures. And the SC 5000, we're going to talk about that one. We have run out of time. We'll keep going and see if we can get through all of this. We may not have time for questions, but part 1, the majority of that is pre-populated. The only thing you have to enter is your district's total low income percentage. And there is a guidance document with our program guidelines that goes through some of the steps on how you should calculate your LEA's low income percentage. Part B is where all the information is. That's where your campus information is for each campus. There is a part that pre-populates from the ASTED tables. It's your campus number, your campus name, and your grade levels. That is updated nightly by our eGrants support team, our IT support team. However, it's based on data that has been validated by the ASTED database system. If you enter changes and ASTED has not validated and cleared it, it may not show up on the SC 5000, just to let you know. But normally it does have an overnight turnaround. There is a feature here for if you applied for Title 1A and you filled out the schedule last year, you can copy prior year data. It only copies 3 fields: your basis of eligibility, your campus status, and the consolidated funds, whether you're using Title 1A only, federal funds, or federal, state, and local. You will still have to enter in enrollment, and your low income percentages for each campus. But just because it pre-populates doesn't mean that those 3 line items you can't change. You can change the basis of eligibility, the campus status, before you save and submit. And of course, on here, you'll notice there's something missing that wasn't there, that was in 2021 application. It was in there in 1920, but it's not there anymore, is the per pupil allocation. So we're not looking at the per pupil allocation and the total campus allocations to maintain locally. You still have to follow the same rules when you're determining campuses to be served. For a multiple attendance area, the 75% low income percentage of the campuses most in need should be served in rank and serve order. Then once you've served those, you can do campuses either in grade span grouping or continue in rank and serve. All that documentation on how you're allocating those funds are kept locally. And again, if you look at that SC 5000 guidance document, it goes through some of the examples of how you set these up. And there's a link down here for a guidance document that USDE posted a couple years back that also has very good information on how to determine these. When we go through the SC 5000 training, we'll go into more detail as to some of these different items and some of the different types of eligibilities that you can use. The most common ones we see are for campus designations are school-wide, targeted assistance, or skipped. And last is to remind you that under compliance reports, you'll find your gun-free district report. It's available right now. So that does need to be completed and submitted so that we can process your application. It's fairly a single page form. There's 2 line items. Line 1, if you are applying either independent fiscal agent or member of a SSA, you should mark yes, that you are going to be applying for these funds. And then line 2 is if you had any incidents with a student that brought a firearm, yes or no. If you mark no, then you just complete the bottom and submit the form, you're done. If you mark yes, the campus report should show up underneath the district report, so you can select a campus to include that information. Just to let you know, that's the only, the district report is the only thing that has to be submitted first in order to process the application. The campus report you still need to complete if there was an incident, and our program staff will be looking at that to make sure you complete that and make sure that we have all that documentation, because that is required under statute to continue receiving these federal funds. Here are some different resources and links to some of the different training and other resource page, our compliance page, waivers, some other guidance documents, and the guidance document for the SC 5000. And I don't know if we have any time for questions, but while we're doing that, I'm going to share with you the list of your regional assignments for your contacts for your negotiators so that you can see who your negotiator is for your region. Okay, so I'm hoping you can see that. Those are your regional assignments. Do we have time for any questions that we may be able to answer?
I will go ahead and take a few, even though we are up on the hour here. Let's see. How would software apply as capital outlay? We received that one a couple of times.
Yeah, it all depends on how your budget office codes it. Some software, if you're actually purchasing software to be installed into actual equipment, may fall under that threshold and have to be capitalized. In this new digital age that we have everything, a lot of items are web-based and you have to buy users, site licenses for X number of users. Depending on your budget office and your procurement office, how they define that, it may be under contracted services or it may be under capitalization. You would have to refer back to how your budget wants to code that. My best advice is if you're not sure and you can't get a hold of your budget office, budget it under 6,600 because it's easier to move it out of 6,600 because everything requires specific approval, and move it into 63 or 62 in an amendment than to add it in after the fact after you've already purchased it and you're going to ask for it to be retroactive back to the date that you procured the item. So that's a difficult question to answer because every district has different policies on that.
Can you provide a couple of examples of what would be considered debt services?
The best example that I've seen in the past, and I've only seen a couple of them, is the district has started an initiative to try to provide computer labs at every campus. And they want to do this so that every campus has the new computer at the beginning of the year, but they can't afford to purchase all those computers out of one budget year. So they've gotten a contract with a vendor to do a 2-year lease purchase. And they're going to be paying it out in a 2-year period. And at the end of that 2-year period, the district outright owns it. That's the best example because that's what usually I see. And it was with technology. Of course, technology now, the price has gotten down a lot less. So we're seeing debt services a lot less on the applications as years progress.
On BS 6401, other operating costs for out-of-state travel and educational field trips, we're putting a dollar amount now. If changes need to be made, will we need to amend?
If as long as there's a dollar amount budgeted and you're not exceeding that 25% threshold, you don't have to amend. But then again, my old answer, always refer back to what your local policy is. Some budget offices may ask you to increase it because you're increasing your cost for these travels and field trips, and they want to make sure that it's been budgeted and approved by TEA. But according to our when to amend, as long as you're not exceeding 25% and it is an item that has been budgeted and approved on the application, an amendment is not required.
Okay, we're going to take just a couple of more questions. Any questions that we were not able to answer today, feel free to reach out to your grant negotiator. Does the WV 4001 need to be completed if we have an unexpected carryover in excess of 15% due to COVID shutdown?
That's an easy answer because since we got a waiver for the 1920 grant and we're extending those grants through September of 2021, we will not have carryover showing up on the 2021 application. And to answer your question, the 4001 TEA completes year after year if we see that an LEA is required request of a waiver to exceed the 15%. And we're talking about out of 1,250 LEAs, less than 150 from year to year require that waiver. But this year we won't see any utilization of that because there'll be no carryover showing up since we're extending last year's grant.
Is BS 6101 Part 3 just for substitutes or for any payroll positions?
Okay, so the one for substitutes would be if you're using substitute pay for a funding, for one of those funding sources. For all other payroll positions, if it doesn't come up in parts B or C on part 1. And it would just be a checkbox. Once you've checked that box, if you're going to add additional positions, an amendment's not required, because we're just looking at the intent of what type of positions, whether it's LEA or campus positions, you want to utilize for that funding source for payroll.
Okay, that is all of the questions that we will be taking at this time. Again, feel free to reach out to your negotiators. And Carlos, do you have any final remarks?
I just thank all of you for, this was a real quick presentation, and we went through this application, but feel free to reach out to your regional negotiator, or you can reach out to me. We're here to help you. This is a unique situation, and I hope everyone is doing well, and we will continue to communicate over the summer as we work through all of these applications to get you these funds so that you can start running your programs for next year. I thank all of you, and have a pleasant day and a better tomorrow. Thank you.